delighted to welcome you to this session of the 15th Jaipur Literature Festival, protected by Dettol, Banega Swasth India. It is our pleasure to present today The Promise, Damon Galgut in conversation with Maya Jasanoff. Damon Galgut is a master of the knot, the stubborn rope, which shapes and binds people to places, politics, profits, the past. The Promise, sharp, meditative, and winner of the 2021 Booker Prize for Literature, conveys the play of power in relationship with self, society, and state against the backdrop of post-apartheid South Africa. A white family, nettled by changing society, wrangles over a farm and a delayed promise. As South Africa churns with a violent past, turbulent politics, and the rubbles of change, Galgut weaves the stories and struggles of relationship from both. His other works include A Sinless Season, The Good Doctor, and Arctic Summer. In conversation with Maya Jasanoff, Galgut discusses his writing style, process, inspirations, and the essence of his latest work. Damon Galgut. Damon Galgut is a novelist and playwright who published his first novel at the age of 18 and has published another 8 books ever since. He was awarded the 2021 Booker Prize for his novel, The Promise, making him the 3rd writer from South Africa to win the Booker. He was previously shortlisted in 2003 and 2010 for the Booker Prize. Maya Jasanoff. Maya Jasanoff is the XT and Nancy Yang Professor of Arts and Science at Harvard University. She's the author of the prize-winning books Edge of Empire, Liberty's Exiles, and The Dawn Watch, Joseph Conrad in a Global World. A Guggenheim Fellow, Jasanoff won the 2017 Wyndham Campbell Prize for Nonfiction and is a frequent contributor to publications including The New Yorker and The Guardian. She's a chair of judges for 2021 Booker Prize. Please feel free to send in your questions or comments by typing them in the comment section. Do follow our social media handles to get notifications on the upcoming sessions. Ladies and gentlemen, The Promise, Damon Galgut in conversation with Maya Jasanoff. Over to you, Maya.
So Damon, it's great to see you again. The last time that we met was, which was also the first time that we met, was in the immediate wake of my announcing that you had won this year's Booker Prize. And I must admit that at that moment, in some ways, of course, I was very excited to be able to do this, but I also felt sort of terrible for imposing upon you suddenly this burden of having to go out and talk about your book endlessly for at least another year. And I'm wondering how, after that somewhat shell-shocking experience, as it seemed, how it's all feeling to you 2 months later.
Yeah. A little more real, I think. It's become a fact rather than the kind of dim and distant shock that it seemed at the time. Yeah, but it's definitely brought about a big life change, which I'm still figuring out. But I think that might take a while yet.
Well, in the course of our conversation, I'd love to talk with you a little bit more about where this particular book sits, as you understand it, in the kind of trajectory of the work that you've been producing, of course, at such a high level for so long. But I wonder if it makes sense to start by talking about The Promise, the novel that did just win the Booker Prize. And, one of the things that was so compelling about the novel to those of us on the judging panel was the extent to which it kept repaying rereading. One of the features of the Booker Prize is that not only do all of the judges read all of the books, but we read them multiple times, particularly when they get to the final stage. And one of the things that I was struck by is, of course, that the title itself keeps giving up new meanings as one reads the book. I wondered if you could, partly by way of introducing the novel to those listeners of this session who haven't read it, maybe unpack the title for us a little bit and tell us about, what it represents. And I'd also be curious to know at what stage in the writing process the title occurred to you.
The book deals with a white South African family, mixed English Afrikaans, called the Swarts, and they live on a sort of patchwork of small holdings outside Pretoria, which is where I grew up. And it covers a span of some 30, 40 years through the device of using 4 family funerals, each one in a different decade. And we only really see that family and what's happening to them in the space of the day or two in each window that opens on a funeral. But the title itself, The Promise, refers to something else, which is a promise that the youngest daughter of this family, Amor, believes she heard her father make at her mother's request. Her mother on her deathbed asked her father to give a small patch of land with a kind of broken down house on it to the Black lady who's worked for their family for decades and decades. And she hears her father promise that he will do it. And at least part of what gives substance to the trajectory of the novel is how the family does an elaborate dance to avoid following through on delivery of that promise. So although it's just a thread in the book, it's obviously quite a significant one, and it takes on extra significance because the title, it gives the title to the book. So it's quite odd to think that if I'd given the book a different title, perhaps that aspect of the story might have had far less weight, because it is the thing that, you know, people clearly refer to when they talk about the book. But in fact, the title was the last thing to arrive. I had a long deliberation with my publisher, and I had a very different working title, which I'll share with you for what it's worth. I was calling it Dark Love, which was a kind of a play, I think maybe too obscure for non-South Africans, on the name of Amor Swart, who is the young daughter I've just mentioned, because literally that would translate as black love or dark love. And I had a thought that I might, you know, work it into the book in the form of her, this character's love for South Africa being a kind of dark, complicated kind of love, which is what I feel for my country most of the time. Anyway, for better or for worse, that option was nixed by the publishers, probably for better. And we went with the title of The Promise, which I liked and seems absolutely central, but I suppose as a title is kind of neutral. It doesn't have a lyrical conjuring sort of quality, but in fact that's sort of what appeals to me, because it's neutral in a sense that you could hang a great many things on that hook. And it's gratifying to me, of course, to hear that, you know, rereadings of the book might have delivered up other meanings or other possible meanings of that allusion. I mean, you know, it refers, sorry, yeah.
Well, I was just going to pick up on what you said about how it's a sort of neutral word, and yet I actually don't entirely see it that way, simply in as much as promise is a word that also means potential. And I wondered if you might just say something about that, because, you know, one of the things that readers of the book will discover is that it spans approximately 40 years in the life of South Africa as well as this family. And in the course of that, there are, as it were, promises made to subsections of the population and promises made to the nation, but there's also a kind of enduring feeling of potential. Where do you stand, as it were, on the notion that South Africa itself is a nation of promise?
Well, one of the possible, other meanings to the title is the promise that South Africa held or seemed to hold for many of us back in 1994 when we had our first free democratic election here. It really did feel as if, you know, the boulder had rolled away from the mouth of the cave and we were emerging into the light. And that all things seemed possible. So yes, a great deal of potential in that feeling. I think it's pretty clear from the arc of the book that I don't believe, South Africa has lived up to that potential. And I think that's a fairly common feeling here. I mean, there was something unreal in the kind of giddiness with which we greeted our new future. And I think partly, actually, it comes out of a certain naivety, and the naivety of having lived in a test tube or a closed bottle in a way, because growing up in South Africa under apartheid was basically growing up under sanctions, no fresh ideas flowing in and out. You know, the media was muzzled. There was no television in South Africa until the 70s. So there was a feeling that everything was sort of frozen in place, and all of that sort of lifted away suddenly, overnight, it felt like. So yeah, there was a certain unreality to the expectation that South Africa could transform itself utterly into some utopia. But where we are now is, you know, even in realistic terms, quite far from what we could potentially have achieved. So that's partly what the book's dealing with. I mean, I think also on an individual basis for various characters, as for most of us in our lives, we feel, you know, when we're young, that the world perhaps holds great promise for us, that we are going to do things with our lives. Most of us reach a certain point where you realize you're at best only going to be doing some of those things. But I think very specifically for these white characters who find their personal fortunes overturned by, you know, this political change in South Africa, the sort of promise that South Africa might have held out to a white family or white individuals like these has very much changed, been withdrawn in lots of cases. Mm-hmm. So yeah, I mean, those are at least two instances of, you know, potentials, promises not fulfilled.
Mm. You know, I was struck by your mentioning just now that television didn't come to South Africa until the 1970s. And, you know, one of the features of your writing that stands out here, and as a consequence of your own writing across genres, including film and the stage, is its very visual quality. How do writing for different or in different genres, how does writing in different genres, do you think, sort of play out when you're in the process of writing a novel, for instance? I mean, do you get ideas that you think, okay, this is a novel idea as opposed to such and such idea, which is a play idea? How does this kind of cross-media writing work for you?
I mean, there's a bit of that, because I think certain ideas are better suited to, you know, different forms. Some things you just cannot realize through language, you know, and there's some things that can only be realized through language. But, you know, I know I get described, I think simply because Wikipedia once described me that way, as a novelist and a playwright. But in fact, the last play I wrote was sort of back in my 20s. It was a long way back. I deliberated, you know, for a while about whether I wanted to be a playwright or a novelist. And I made up my mind that, you know, novels were my thing. And I haven't changed my mind yet. But that's not to say that, you know, theatre hasn't been a big sort of part of my life. I did study at drama school. I taught there for a while. I still love to attend theatre. So, you know, that mode of storytelling is very close to my, I want to say my heart, but it's actually to my imagination. I need to visualize things before I can actually breathe any sort of linguistic life into them. And cinema is a very big deal for me. I watch a lot of movies. I'm very, very interested in it. I'd, you know, love to, you know, write a movie script that gets made one day. But in the case of this particular book, I did write a movie script that absolutely changed the way I was approaching the narrative. Although I think, ironically, that very little of my script ended up in the, you know, the finished film. But that's no matter, because it gave me something else entirely, which was kind of, you know, the key to the narrative voice of this particular book, because I'd started it in a way that was far more conventional, I guess, for this sort of narrative, a third person omniscient narrator. And, you know, there are rules about how you're meant to do that. But breaking away from the book and doing the film script just sort of triggered other possibilities, I guess. So that when I came back to the novel, it wasn't that I was actively looking, it certainly didn't occur to me, oh, I can use techniques from film to, liven up my book. That was never a conscious part of my thinking. But something in my mind was frustrated with the limitations of conventional third-person narration, was looking for ways to break it open and, make the sort of latent voices of the text present, if I can put it like that. And coming fresh from the film to the novel, I just suddenly saw that nothing held me back except convention. And that if I chose to break the conventions and could make it work, that's a very important line here, because the conventions are there for a reason. They uphold the form because the form has been found to work in certain ways. But I realized that if I could break the rules and still make it work, that would be fine. And I was never really sure of that, to be honest, right through the writing. But what I did feel was that this approach fitted very well with my own sensibility, that the way my mind works in narrative very much lines up with cinematic logic, and that if I applied that cinematic logic, it opened up the text for me in all sorts of ways, and I was very happy to experiment and play with that. And it's my good fortune that most readers have been receptive to that mode of storytelling, because I wasn't sure until I was done, quite honestly, whether it wasn't just a massive, messy failure.
We've been talking about the role of cinema in your imagination. Of course, it's also a deeply intertextual book, at least it seems as such to a reader like me. I find in it sort of echoes of Woolf or echoes of Faulkner. And of course, it only later struck me when somebody pointed it out that there's a rather conspicuous echo of Forster's Howard's End. And of course, Forster was, featured in your full. So, I've been drawing you out on this question of how cinema and for that matter, the stage affects your imagination. But how do you understand your writing in relation to this kind of, really boundless repertoire of texts that one encounters and lives with and writes against and writes with? How much are those kinds of voices sort of popping into your head as you're working?
A fair amount. Reading has been my central, enduring obsession since childhood, really. I have an apartment absolutely jammed with books. I spend, a great deal of every day reading and thinking about what I'm reading. Books, to state the obvious, matter a great deal to me. So even on an internal level, when I'm not working, I'm in some kind of dialogue with other novels, just in my own mind. The writers that spring to mind, for you in the examples you've just thrown out, but also for almost everybody who's responded to or commented on this text, the writers that come to mind are mostly the modernists who were playing with different voices and with time. So, of course, they are the force or presence that hovers most strongly over this particular book. There are also, I was not in a conscious dialogue with any of, the people whose work I can see, feeds into this. With Virginia Woolf, very obviously, and Faulkner being probably the strongest contenders, quite a lot of Beckett there too. But of course, these are writers who I've engaged with repeatedly through multiple books and through multiple readings of the same books. And I guess, for me, the novel, how to put this succinctly, the novel is no longer at the center of cultural life. I think everyone can see it. Other things have taken precedence. And if you really, really want, a lever to change the world, the novel is probably not the lever any longer. It was at one point. That doesn't, for me, diminish the importance of the novel. In fact, it opens up certain possibilities that might not have been open before. And I don't believe, the novel's about to die or disappear or anything like that, just that it's moved perhaps from the center towards the margins. But the the novelists that most excited me in my early reading years, the novelists who seemed to me to be the boldest, the bravest, the ones who were the most hungry to break the rules and set new rules, were in fact the modernists. That seems to me in some way to have been the high watermark of the literary experiment, and when the time when the novel very much was at the center of cultural life. So, those are good models to follow. And it's what they were doing with breaking the form and remaking it that kind of got me most excited about writing books myself, because it just excited all the writerly instincts in me that, want to do the same thing. It's not so easy to do. You don't just aspire to break the form. You have to understand the form before you can break it. You have to know why you're breaking it and how to break it and so on. So all of that reading is sort of, stored up there, and in some way one draws on it, but it feels in the moment like what you're serving up, what you're making is very much your own. It's only sort of afterwards that I can see, the presence of Virginia and William and Samuel, they're all there, but happy to accommodate.
It's so interesting what you say about the novel being, at least at one stage, able to change the world, because, one of the longer term consequences of modernism was to privilege a certain kind of, if you will, aestheticized, interiorist kind of narrative in place of what they considered to be the kind of conventional banal realism that had preceded them. And this, in a way, kind of opened up a distinction between what would now be called literary fiction and what would be called popular fiction. And the modernists really won when it came to the legacies of, or to the ways in which literature is studied in English departments to this day. And yet one could also argue that it was those very techniques which made the novel sort of less present in the kind of everyday discourse of many societies. I just find it a kind of interesting thing to chew on, also to think about which genres kind of resonate in which societies. One could certainly see that, for example, poetry has been an incredibly important literary repository in the making of, among others, modern Indian nationalism and many kinds of nationalism in the modern world. So anyway, I find this it's a very interesting question. Sort of, what is the novel for, and what has it been for over?
No, it is, and
years.
you raise things that actually I'm not sufficiently familiar with really to comment intelligently, but I'm very interested in what you say. I mean, an interesting question for me is whether any of those figures, the high modernists who kind of defined that period of literature, whether any of them, if they were working now, would find a publisher. And I have my doubts, to be honest. I think if Virginia Woolf had to be sending in her books now, it would be much too difficult, much too complicated. So that divergence you mentioned between popular literature and, literary literature, would seem to be quite a significant one. I'm not sure that if I didn't have a track record writing-wise, that this book would have been picked up either. I mean, I might be wrong, and it's impossible to know, but I just think that what's prioritized in publishing, which is of course based on what publishers believe readers are hungry for, is not form breaking, actually, so much, or if it is, it's not breaking the old forms or making the ones that they made. It's something quite other. I'm not really qualified to say, and of course I can't prove it. I mean, Patrick White, who I think the Australian novelist, who is considered a modernist, although he's quite old-fashioned in lots of respects. There was a sort of scandal in Australia, I recall, where somebody sent in the opening chapters of one of his most famous books to a bunch of publishers, and it was turned down. But more worryingly, nobody recognized it. So yeah, I wonder what the fate of people like Virginia Woolf or Faulkner would be these days. I think it would be considered too challenging and too Yeah, which is why it's especially gratifying that a book that's written in the same mode, received the recognition that you and your jury gave it. So extra gratitude to you.
I vividly remember going on a backpacking trip around Australia and Southeast Asia, and I was carrying tons of books because one does, and along the way I would go to used bookstores to slough off the ones I had already finished. And I went into a bookstore in Australia and I had read a novel by Patrick White, and it was one of the ones that I was trying to pass off to the bookshop, and they sort of held it at some remove, as if it were some kind of smelly thing. And I mean, it was in impeccable condition, I must say, so it was nothing to do with that. And they looked at it with this kind of disdain and said, well, what's this? We can't use this. And I said, it's only, one of the most celebrated Australian novelists of the 20th century. And they wouldn't take it. They wouldn't take it. And I was so upset by this that I think it was
there you go. You see,
made me never want to, carry around that many books to try to get rid of them again. But something else that you said though in you're talking about intertextuality also, I think is worth following up on, which is this idea that when one is a young reader, one is consuming so much stuff, and it may come in at a particular moment and land there, even if you don't revisit it later. And I think that many writers probably who have been, active readers of, if you will, the sort of British literary tradition or English language literary tradition share that experience of sort of coming up as a teenager in the face of Faulkner or Woolf, or the people who broke all the conventions. And that idea of breaking form is intrinsically appealing to the teenager. Right. And it sort of hits and sticks, even if some of the specific techniques or whatever, don't entirely. And I raise this because you wrote your first novel, as I understand it, when you were a teenager, and you've written, now, what is it? Is it 9 novels or something like that?
I believe so. Yeah.
Yeah, so the next one will be your 10th, and I ask, maybe somewhat selfishly as a writer who's, got a few books behind and hopefully a few books ahead, how do you kind of think about that early self that was writing novels in relation to the self you are now? And I'm here also looping back deliberately to something that you dropped right at the beginning of our conversation about, sort of where you find yourself in the course of a literary life, not least with this prize kind of coming along. What has surprised you and not about sort of looking at where you're at as a writer?
In a way, what surprises me most is to have achieved any level of vindication or success, because for a great many years, it certainly didn't feel like that was on the cards. I started very young, too young, to be honest. That first book embarrasses me in the way that adolescent writing embarrasses most of us. But I did have an eagerness and excitement about the literary project, which age has sort of wrung out of me to a large degree. I'm still excited by books and by writing, but not at all with the same intensity any longer. So I guess again, there was a naive hunger to do this, and one of the virtues and limitations of being young is that you don't know how difficult things are, and you're therefore not intimidated by them. So I sort of threw myself into writing books. My first published book was, in fact, I think the third one I'd written. I'd written a couple of absolutely dire manuscripts before that. And I got an undue amount of attention because of my age. I was, 18 years old or something. And a lot of the media attention and response that I got was focused on that fact rather than on, any achievement of the book, which was negligible. But that fades, as you get older. No one's interested in your youth any longer. And what they're interested in is, can you write another book? Can you hit a certain level, and that got more difficult, in fact. I lost, I suppose, the confidence of just being able to throw myself in. But I also became conscious, as one does, with the, when writing moves from being a passion to a job. I mean, job is too reductive a word, but you become aware that you're fitting into a tradition, that you're just one link in a chain, that there are obligations and expectations, that it's not just about expressing yourself as teenagers like to think of. So I guess there's far more of a conscious sense of one's role and duty, and especially in a country like South Africa, where I started out feeling like I could write about absolutely anything. And then, in my second book, which is actually the one I wish I'd kicked off my career with, I wrote about being ill as a child and the tremendous effect it had on my family, which felt to me like an absolutely valid subject. But a number of reviewers kind of jumped on me, because this was back in apartheid times. South Africa was burning. I mean, the country was in crisis. And basically, the kind of tone of certain reviews was, well, this is all very well, but I mean, who is this white privileged kid writing about his own life when his country is in the grip of a huge moral crisis? And that came as a kind of a cold shock to me, because in some way I had to recognize it was true. And that I, as a writer, had an obligation to speak about things perhaps not related directly to myself, although one's nation, of course, is related directly to me. Anyway, this is a very long-winded way of saying that I think the sense of a writer's role and what goes with it becomes far more of a weight as you go on. But then there's another sort of freedom that comes as you get older, and if you've done this for long enough, you do sort of feel as if you've earned your spurs in some way. And at this point in my writing career, I mean, it's an enormous acknowledgement for which I'll always be grateful to have won this particular prize. Even without the prize, though, I think I'm nearly 60 years old. I give far less of a damn now what people think of me. That's one of the great liberations that comes with age. And there's part of me that thinks, well, I'm back to feeling like I can write about whatever I want to. There's a certain power, in other words, with perhaps the longevity of sticking with this, thinking, well, I've paid my dues and I have earned the right, maybe, to set some of the terms of the literary discussion rather than to learn them and obey, if I can put it that way.
In our last few minutes, I'd love to pick up on something that was nested in your response there, which is the question of the obligations that one has as a writer, and in particular, the obligations that one may have as a writer of a particular, background or in a particular place. And I'm struck at how much people outside South Africa, at any rate, because I can't speak to the experience within it, respond to this novel, The Promise, and I think much of your other work as being sort of about South Africa. And I wondered, as I thought about that, about the fact that people don't really speak of writing as being a book about Britain or about the United States in quite the same way, although obviously there are versions of that, the great American novel, for example, being one. But that question of sort of writing about a country or being understood to be a spokesperson for a country, do you think that this is a burden that attaches to, is it former colonies, or is it poorer countries, or is it the global South, or is it South Africa in particular, because you are a white South African who, of course, was born during the apartheid era? I mean, who do you think is putting on this burden, and what should one make of it? I say this because as a writer, myself who studies empire, I look at it with a little bit of, I can't help but see it as somewhat constructed, and I can't help but be a little bit mindful of the ways in which people have responded, for example, to many South Asian writers and pointed to the way in which the writers who are very popular outside India or Pakistan are different from the writers who are popular inside India and Pakistan. I just wondered, your sort of reactions to that burden.
Yeah, it's a complicated question, and I don't really have a clear answer, but it's obviously one that's crossed my radar several times over the years. It's my impression, I'm absolutely open to correction, but it's my impression that it's an expectation more of South African writers than of other sort of post-colonial literatures. I mean, I really may be wrong, but I don't get the sense with Indian literature, for example, that every novel in some way is trying to account for the state of the nation or the soul of India or something. But you do have that feeling with South Africa that almost every novel has a kind of a guilty twitch in that direction, that it can't simply be about a particular group of people in a situation. That situation and the people have to represent something larger, history in a certain sense. And it definitely consciously crops up as a question, I think, for most South African writers. Why that is far more difficult to pin down, because of course there is no body of people giving the order that you have to do that. I mean, it filtered to me in the form of those particular reviews that I got, but apartheid is technically over. We're in a different phase here, and it should be possible to write a different sort of South African novel that does not nod its head to politics or history. But it's quite hard to do, actually, because I think the situation that's been bestowed on us is still so beholden to that history. I mean, to quote Faulkner, who seems to have been a big part of this conversation, but he was speaking, I think, about the American South, and he said, the past isn't past yet. And we still have something of that set up here, where although, technically, the laws on the statute books have changed, there's nothing, to stop the society from transforming. In effect, the society is not transformed. We're still sitting with exactly the same profoundly unfair, sort of class system that apartheid created here, where almost everyone who's working class or dispossessed, poor, is a black person, and almost every entitled and privileged person is white. I mean, not 100% across the board, but by and large, that's still the case. So if you write a white character, do you just ignore that? Do you just ignore the history and the background and write about them as if politics and history don't matter, when clearly they do? But at the same time, you don't want to give undue weight to history and politics, because that basically eclipses what sits at the heart of every book that's ever excited me, and that's human beings as a subject. We're not, history and politics are not everything. They're certainly something. They're certainly a very big part of human life, but I don't believe they're everything. So the Stalinist model of literature that's written simply to further the progress of society is not of appeal to me either. But I do think it's realistic, even if people are not consciously aware of it to the degree that we are in South Africa. I do think it's realistic that we are products of our time and place, and that the novelist who is receptive to those elements, it's part of the challenge to use them, reveal them, and show them, and perhaps to try to further the language around them in novelistic terms, so that we're not laden down with, terminology or arid thinking, but that it becomes human. I mean, I keep reminding myself what the novel can do, that takes it beyond journalism or historical writing, which tells you how it feels to be, what happens and what a particular time or place felt like. What the novel can do is tell you how it felt to be human at that particular moment. And I try to keep that at the forefront always. But it's obvious to me, even though it's not the elements that excite me the most, it's obvious to me that history and politics are a presence in most South African novels, and that they they sort of can't not be. They're a presence in everyday life. So to ignore them would be an act of willful denial in a way, even though the burden they impose on the writer is kind of deadly, because it does, the easy solution is cliche, right? To reach for cliches and to demonstrate that you're on the right side of history and all of that, which makes for a set of rigid sort of cliche gestures that a lot of writers go through. So I do think it's part of the challenge for writers is to find fresh language, to find fresh imaginative avenues with which to kind of reveal the fullness of what goes into being human. And, history is part of it.
Well, it's hard to think of a better note to end on. When we had met in London a couple of months ago, our hope was that we would re-meet in India in person. Instead, it's across this virtual platform. But I know that India is a place that you have returned to frequently, and it has been an imaginative resource for you. So I'm sure that this is a particularly apt context in which to be having this discussion about literature in the world, literature in history, literature in politics, and ultimately what your work shows so well, which is literature and how to be human. So thank you, Damon, for your time. Thank you to our audience for sharing in this conversation across the continents. And thank you to the Jaipur Festival for hosting us.
Thank you, Damon and Maya, for sharing with us the nuances of masterful storytelling. And thank you all for watching and being such a great audience. Please stay logged on to continue to watch with us the series of exciting sessions featuring a stellar list of speakers that have been specially curated for you. Hope to see you all in the next session.